So let's talk about facts. A fact is something that is actually objectively true, but sometimes you might not want people to know those objective facts. Maybe they make you look bad, or you have something to hide, or maybe you're just trying to protect people from something that you don't think that they should know. Whatever the reason, when you want to filter the truth to fit your needs, some propaganda techniques are pretty popular. I'm Moti Lieberman, and this is the Ling Space.
Welcome to the Ling Space.
People have probably been bending the truth for as long as there have been people. As the saying goes, history is written by the victors. Tweaking the story to make you look good just comes naturally, and even little kids will try to lie to get out of trouble. There's been some interesting linguistic research on lying, and we might come back to that in a later episode. But for now, we'll just focus on the idea that there are different kinds of ways to lie. Sometimes it can be pretty direct. If Katniss tells people that she's going to have a baby, when she knows full well that she's not pregnant, she's saying something that she knows isn't true. She's making a statement while believing its opposite. That's a pretty bald-faced lie, but it definitely has a place in the propaganda toolkit. When people talk about fake news, for example, this is usually the type of out-and-out fabrication that they're talking about. The term fake news has actually been around for over a century, but it's become a lot more widespread lately to mean just this: stories made up of whole cloth and presented to the public as news. Satire websites like The Onion often do this as a joke, but often fake news has a less than funny ulterior motive, like to make someone look bad, or as false evidence to back up a point that you're trying to make. It can be tricky to tell apart fake news from real news, especially if you've already got an opinion going in, as most of us do. But ultimately, checking sources and doing a little research can take you a long way towards the truth. This gets harder, though, when we start to look at other ways of lying. For instance, instead of making up stories entirely and packaging them as truth, you could take actual facts and events and just frame them in a way to try to shape people's opinions. For example, let's say that every year you organize a brutal fight to the death between a bunch of teenagers. Harsh, right? So, how can you make people see that in a good light? Well, spinning it like a fancy high-stakes reality show and giving your lucky contestants celebrity status could go a long way. You're not really hiding the facts. Everyone knows that there will only be one survivor, but you can sway people's opinions by framing it in a positive way. With enough spin and glitter, your audience will cheer for the game rather than be appalled at the brutality. But even this kind of spin doctoring is pretty blatant compared to some of the most effective untruths that we see every day. Let's imagine that my friend Haymitch doesn't drink alcohol. If I say Haymitch isn't drunk today, well, that's true, he never is. But does that seem like what I'm trying to say? Or do you get the impression that his soberness is somehow an exception? After all, why did I say Haymitch isn't drunk today if what I meant to say was Haymitch is never drunk? The reason that you're probably reading more into it than I explicitly said is grounded in conversational rules that we've discussed before, the maxims developed by Paul Grice. The maxim of quality assumes that someone who wants to have a cooperative conversation will try to tell the truth. A sentence like, Haymitch isn't drunk today, plays fast and loose with this maxim, but it doesn't technically break it. I'm still saying something that I think is true. But I am breaking a different rule, the maxim of quantity, which says, give all the information that you need and not more. So since Haymitch is never drunk is a perfectly good sentence that I could have said, which would have been the most concise and transparent way to express that idea, I must have had a reason not to say it. By highlighting the fact that he's not drunk today, what I'm doing is implying that he's drunk at other times. And since what I'm implying isn't true, this is called a false implicature. So even though I only told the truth, a lie about Haymitch's drinking habits gets generated by your brain and makes a home there. You come away from the conversation with lies in your head that I didn't even say. Tricky. You can imagine that this is a pretty powerful tool if you're trying to convince someone of something without getting in trouble. Since they're more discreet than flat-out lies, false implicatures show up a lot, everywhere from everyday conversation to advertising to political speeches. And since they play on assumptions that people have about the way that we talk to each other, they're a very effective propaganda tool. Another way to get people thinking what you want also cashes in on universals about how our brains work. Everyone has inherent biases programmed into them, from society, experience, family, media, just living in the world. That's because our brains categorize information into generalities all the time, just to make sense of all the impressions that come our way every day. This leads to what's called implicit bias, assumptions about the way things are that we might not even be consciously aware of. For example, if in your society being good at math is often considered a sign of someone being smart, then you might end up assuming that anyone who's smart is also good at math. In reality, there's all kinds of different ways to be smart, but your brain uses math as a convenient shorthand, saving you the time it would take to start off with every new person you meet without any preconceived assumptions. And although this is really unfortunate for human interactions, because your brain is constantly prejudging people, it's the same mental reflex that does things like tell you that that fruit growing on a tree is probably okay to eat, or that a growling dog could be bad news. Our instincts have an evolutionary basis. They just don't work out so well when dealing with other humans. Unfortunately, because brains are really predictable in this way, capitalizing on people's inherent biases is another common way for propaganda to try and mess with us. Let's say that the country that you live in is divided into a bunch of isolated districts with very little communication between them. And let's say that you, the corrupt leader of this country, want to keep it that way, keep them separated, to make sure that the masses don't rise up against you. How do you pull that off? Well, one way you could do it is make them compete for resources and recognition in a fight to the death. Or you could take it down a notch and play them off each other psychologically by drawing on something called the fundamental attribution error. You can think about it this way. If your friend's short-tempered with you, you might assume that they're having a bad day. But if a stranger is short-tempered with you, you might end up thinking that they're just a mean person. Fundamental attribution error happens when you ascribe someone's behavior to their internal nature rather than their external circumstances. And it's a lot easier to fall into that cognitive trap when you're dealing with someone that you don't really know. You can probably already see how this could be used for propaganda. Let's go back to that hypothetical corrupt leader who wants to keep the districts fighting against each other rather than united against him. Now, each community has a wide variety of people in it, with complex dreams and personalities and skill sets. But if wealth and labor are divided up unevenly, and certain districts are said to have certain traits, then you're setting the stage for fundamental attribution error to rear its ugly head. If your rich district buddy falls on hard times, you'll be much more likely to blame the circumstances rather than the person. But if you hear your peers talking about an impoverished district, you might easily assume that a lack of ambition or ability is responsible for their hardships. And the problem gets even more pronounced if you prevent people from different districts to interact. Instead of getting to know each other as complex human beings, all you have to work from is your implicit bias. And it's hard to challenge your biases when they're being reinforced by a propaganda machine. There's one more way that people can manipulate information to specific ends. Instead of making stuff up or capitalizing on preconceived ideas, you could just selectively omit information from existing material, or prevent unwanted content from being released. When this is done by a government, it's called censorship. Censorship is one of those words that gets used in a lot of different ways to mean a lot of different things, so we need to be clear about what it isn't. Censorship shouldn't be confused with boycott or objection. There's a difference between an idea not being given a podium and an idea being banned. So it's important to remember that rules protecting freedom of speech apply equally to someone who wants to express an idea and someone who thinks that that idea is objectionable and speaks out against it. The right to speech doesn't mean the right to an audience. Anyone is allowed to talk, but that doesn't oblige anyone to listen. What censorship is, then, is the selective banning or removal of content based on some criteria. And although a lot of governments, if they want to be objective, have rules preventing them from censoring stuff, that isn't always the case. So, let's say that you've managed to keep your different districts isolated and distracted by a bloodthirsty annual battle royale. Censorship can have the same aims as propaganda, like political gain or manipulation, but a lot of the time it's actually presented as a way to protect people, especially youth, from objectionable ideas. Even in places where freedom of expression is a big deal, there's often rules against hate speech, for example, and governments who otherwise might not get involved will censor content that incites hatred and violence. Some places also choose to shield young people against content that's sexual or profane, like beeping out swear words on TV or the radio. Either way though, censorship implies someone with authority imposing their judgment of what's acceptable onto other people. So there are lots of ways we can get messages out there, some more honest than others. Even if the odds are stacked in your favor, you never want to have to take your eyes off the facts. So we've reached the end of the link space for this week. If you didn't censor our video, you learned that propaganda can present as lies, like fake news. That false implicatures can plant untruths into people's heads while only saying true things. That propaganda taps into the biases that we all carry, often using the fundamental attribution error. And that censorship happens when governments prevent content from being released, often in the aim of protecting youth. The link space is made by all of these amazing people over here. If you want to learn more about other ways that language can mislead, check back on our website. Oh, and while you're there, why not check out our store? We're also on Tumblr, Twitter, and Facebook, and if you want to keep expanding your own personal link space, please subscribe. See you next time. Tara Utsi!